National Radio Company built the receivers that helped win World War II. Their HRO radio sat inside Allied intelligence stations from London to the Pacific, intercepting enemy transmissions that fed directly into the code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park. For decades, National was one of the most respected names in American electronics manufacturing. So how did a company that once supplied receivers to the Royal Navy end up bankrupt, with its name sold off and its factory shuttered for good? It starts, of all places, with a magnetic toy dog in Massachusetts. In October 1914, 3 mechanical engineers from the firm Stone and Webster pooled together exactly $1,000 and incorporated a business called National Toy Company. Warren Hopkins, Walter Balk, and Roswell Douglas had no grand ambitions in electronics. Their early products were phonograph-driven novelties, things like a magnetic dog called Rex and a set of dancing magnetic figures, sold through major department stores like FAO Schwarz and Feline's in Boston. The toys were surprisingly profitable, but the founders wanted something bigger. During the 1920s, when radio swept across America like a fever, National pivoted into manufacturing variable capacitors for radio builders. In 1924, 2 Harvard engineers approached the company about producing their Browning Drake tuner kit, and that single product turned radio into National's core business almost overnight. By 1932, the company had formally dropped the word toy from its name entirely. The person who truly built National into something legendary was James Millen, a Stevens Institute-trained mechanical engineer and prolific radio writer who joined as a consultant in 1926 and took over as chief engineer and general manager by 1927. Over the next 12 years inside the old Cub Knitting Mills factory at 61 Sherman Street in Malden, Massachusetts, Millen turned a small capacitor supplier into one of the most respected receiver manufacturers on the planet, beginning with a lineup of regenerative shortwave receivers that earned a devoted following among amateur radio operators across the country. The product that cemented National's reputation forever was the HRO receiver, developed in the early 1930s when the airline industry and amateur radio operators simultaneously demanded the same thing: a premium receiver with 2 stages of radio frequency preselection and a crystal filter. Its electrical design was co-directed by Herbert Hoover Jr., the former president's son, who was serving at the time as radio chief for Western Air Express. The HRO featured a precision micrometer dial designed by engineer William Graydon Smith and a 20-to-1 vernier gearbox that gave the equivalent of a 12-foot dial scale packed into a desktop unit. Each receiver used individually calibrated plug-in coil sets, with each set requiring roughly 4 hours of hand tuning at the factory. The HRO shipped in March 1935 at a price of $233, and its name came from a shop note scrawled on the Rush prototype that simply read, "Hell of a rush order." When war broke out in Europe, the HRO became essential to the Allied effort almost immediately. Beginning in the summer of 1939, the Royal Navy started ordering them in volume, and when the United States entered the war, the military's instruction to National was blunt: start building HROs, and we will tell you when to stop. Employment at the Malden factory surged from a few hundred workers to roughly 2,500. An estimated 10,000 HRO units saw British service aboard warships, at shore listening stations, in diplomatic communications posts, and critically, at the Y service intercept stations, whose intelligence output fed directly to the code-breaking teams at Bletchley Park. The design was so dominant that even the German firms Siemens and Korting produced their own copies based on captured units. After the war, National rode that momentum into its commercial golden age. In 1947, an NC-173 receiver accompanied Thor Heyerdahl aboard the Kon-Tiki raft during his famous crossing of the Pacific Ocean. Through the 1950s and the 1960s, the company was recognized as one of the Big Four American amateur radio manufacturers, alongside Hammarlund, Hallicrafters, and Collins, advertising heavily in QST magazine and producing a string of well-regarded receivers and transceivers. In 1956, National even collaborated with MIT to develop the Atomicron, the first commercial cesium beam atomic clock, a genuine scientific milestone that proved too expensive to ever turn a profit. The crown jewel of this era was the HRO 500, a fully solid-state, frequency-synthesized receiver that appeared on the cover of Popular Electronics in 1964 and is still regarded by enthusiasts as one of the finest shortwave receivers ever built. What happened next inside the National Radio Company boardroom is the part of this story that nobody saw coming. The seeds of National's collapse were planted before the war even started. Controlling owner Warren Hopkins had been pushing to pivot the company toward mass-market broadcast radios, cheap tabletop sets designed for retailers like Sears and Montgomery Ward, with the goal of turning National into a household name. James Millen, the man who had built the company's entire reputation on precision engineering, refused to go along with it. He walked out in May 1939 to found his own company, the James Millen Manufacturing Company. If National had found a way to keep him, this would be a very different story. In one stroke, the company lost its chief engineer, its general manager, its most talented product designer, and its most effective public voice. Hopkins died of cancer in the early 1940s, and no one of Millen's caliber ever replaced him. The same wartime expansion that made National a powerhouse was about to become its biggest liability. After the war, the company spread itself across military, industrial, consumer, and amateur products, including a brief and unsuccessful venture into television receivers in the late 1940s. The high-end equipment remained excellent, but the bread and butter middle of the product line started slipping. A company that once hand-calibrated every single coil set was now cutting corners on its mid-range consumer radios, and the amateur radio community noticed. National could have pulled back to what made it great, could have doubled down on the precision engineering that defined its name. Instead, the company went in the opposite direction. After longtime President William Ready retired in 1953, control passed to an accountant named Charles Hornbostel, and National went public on the stock exchange. A Wall Street investment group led by Louis Lerner acquired a controlling stake, created a separate entity called National Radio Company to house the commercial and amateur work, pumped out press releases touting a corporate turnaround to inflate the stock price, and then quietly sold their shares once the price climbed. That is the kind of financial maneuvering that makes engineers want to throw radios through windows. Several product lines, the production machinery, and even the original National Company name were eventually sold to Japanese interests, though the buyers never continued the famous HRO or NC receiver designs in any meaningful form. The real question is, what finally killed National Radio Company for good? The answer was not one bad decision, but an entire industry collapsing underneath it. Through the 1970s and 1980s, Japanese manufacturers including Yaesu, Kenwood, and ICOM systematically overtook the American amateur radio equipment market with solid-state transceivers that delivered superior performance at lower prices. National was not alone in this. All four members of the Big Four, National, Hammarlund, Hallicrafters, and Collins, were effectively driven from the civilian amateur market within the same generation. National retreated entirely into government and military contracting, surviving as a hollowed-out version of the company that once built receivers for wartime intelligence operations. The successor corporation, a renamed remnant of a holding company called Fan Well Corp., limped along until Massachusetts corporate records listed it as inactive on December 31, 1990. Its remaining assets were dispersed at a bankruptcy auction the following year, closing the books on a 77-year run. Today, no active company operates under the National Radio Company name, and there is no live trademark for the HRO receiver brand in electronics categories. But what endures is the equipment itself. National receivers still trade regularly on auction sites, with early HRO units and the solid-state HRO 500 commanding prices in the low thousands of dollars. Original 1935 HRO receivers with complete hand-calibrated coil sets are especially prized among vintage radio collectors because those coils remain the single biggest driver of value. The Smithsonian holds records and equipment from National's Atomicron Atomic Clock Project, and museums in New England and the United Kingdom preserve examples of the receivers that once listened to the world's most dangerous secrets. What survived National Radio Company is not a brand, not a trademark, not a building in Malden. It is the radios themselves, still pulling in signals on workbenches and in amateur radio shacks more than 70 years after they rolled off the factory floor.